Aiboan, Vanakkam, Assalamu alaikum, and a very good evening. On behalf of AmCham Sri Lanka and our series partner IFS, welcome to the third in our exclusive series of Premier Talks. As you know, over the past few months, AmCham Sri Lanka has created and curated a series of webinars or online discussions, as I like to call them, on a myriad topics which are of immediate and relevant impact to you and your business. We at AmCham Sri Lanka are pleased to continue as your partner, your knowledge partner, bringing you the expert insights, experience, and expertise of a diverse range of topics and speakers, and especially here today as we head into the third in this exclusive series. The AmCham Sri Lanka IFS Premier Series is a series of inspirational, thought-provoking, and insightful presentations from global influencers and thought leaders. Dr. Harley Sayedin, our inaugural speaker, shared with us his insights on sustainable growth. Krishna Ramachandra spoke about the importance of thought leadership in this ever-evolving world. And in the next few months, we have lined up for you similar global influencers, the likes of James Kim, Colin Elkins, Deepa Harris, Melanie Maharachi, Shanika Amrasekara, and Vanushi Walters, just to name a few. So don't forget to lock in your diary for the third Thursday of each month for the AmCham Sri Lanka Premier Series. Now it's my pleasure to introduce AmCham Sri Lanka President Prasantha Jayamaha to present your speaker for this evening.
Thank you, Roy. I take great pleasure in introducing the guest speaker this evening. He is Mr. Stephen Okun. Stephen is the founder and CEO of AmCham Advisors. He's currently considered a leader in corporate affairs, sustainability, stakeholder engagement in the Asia-Pac region. He is also an ASEAN representative for Emerging Markets Private Equity Association, EMPEA. Living and working in Singapore since 2003, Mr. Okun created and led Asia Pacific's public affairs for both global investment firm KKR and the global logistics firm UPS, as well as being a leader of multiple business chambers and industry associations. He is a former chairman of both the American Chamber of Commerce in Singapore and the Asia-Pac Council of American Chambers of Commerce, APCAC. Stephen also served in the administration of President Bill Clinton as Deputy General Counsel at the US Department of Transportation from 1994 to 99. Welcome to the AmCham Premier Series, Stephen. I invite you to share your thoughts and insights on what Asian businesses can expect under a Biden administration and how we can best prepare for these trade and policy changes, and what might those, in your view, those trade and policy changes look like. After you speak, we shall open up the floor for any questions and clarifications from the audience. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you so much. I really wish I were in Sri Lanka with you now. It's an amazing country, and love the time I've been able to spend there up in the tea trails and down in Gal and on the beach. So, but we're doing the second best thing. And what I want to do with the presentation today is, before we can talk about, where we're going, we kind of need to know, where we are and how we got here. And so that's how I'm going to frame the presentation, and give a way for businesses to think about how the Biden administration is going to be thinking, and then being able to adapt to this new US administration, because whether you do business in the United States, whether you do businesses with US companies, are a US company, or even if you don't, the change we are going to have from a trade and foreign policy perspective and a domestic policy perspective from the Biden administration to the Biden administration from the Trump administration is going to have serious business consequences. So I'm going to use a slideshow to walk through some of these major points, and then we can move on to a discussion. In addition to being at all of the being with my own firm, I'm also a senior advisor for McClarty Associates. And you kind of think of McClarty Associates kind of like we're a State Department for the private sector. And in fact, my colleague at McClarty Associates is Bob Blake, who I'm sure from his tenure as ambassador, many of you know. So Bob sends his regards, and that's who we kind of have at McClarty. It's former ambassadors, trade negotiators, White House officials, business leaders, and really try and help businesses think about how to deal with governments and to work at the nexus of policy and business. So as mentioned, I served in the Clinton administration. This is what I used to look like a long time ago. And I put this picture up just kind of as a disclaimer. Yes, look, I'm a Democrat and I support Democrats. I certainly supported Joe Biden, but I take off my partisan hat because I really try and think about what's happening from a government perspective, not a political perspective, because that's how you're going to be able to best work with businesses in addressing our new government. So I think this chart pretty much sums up the politics in the United States in what drove Donald Trump really to his winning the Republican nomination, his winning in 2016, and almost winning again in 2020, although Joe Biden did win pretty clearly in the end. So in 1985, the typical worker in the United States, his salary or her salary, but more likely in 85, his salary would cover a family of four's major expenses on 30 weeks. And then you'd have the rest to spend on education. If you wanted to, you wanted to support your kid going to college, you want to take a holiday, whatever it is you wanted to do. Well, that has changed a lot over the period from 1985 to today. And in fact, in 2018, and so probably, about the same now, it took a typical worker 53 weeks of work to cover housing, health insurance, transportation, and to send the family to college. Obviously, there's only 52 weeks in a year. So this shrinking income, this inability of blue collar, workers, of non-college educated workers to have a good life wasn't there anymore. And this is what Donald Trump recognized. Other people recognized it too, but he was the most successful at recognizing it, building a campaign around it, and taking it to the White House. And so this hasn't changed with Donald Trump in office, and this dynamic is still there for President Biden, or President-elect Biden, I should say, to deal with when he becomes President Biden. Okay, so that's the backdrop that headed into 2020, into the 2016 election and into the 2020 election. As I say, like Joe Biden won, he was a clear winner. He was certainly a clear winner when it came to the popular vote. He was a clear winner when it came to the Electoral College, which is all that matters in the United States, because Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in 2016, but she did not win the Electoral College. Joe Biden happened to win by the same exact number as Donald Trump, and Donald Trump referred to his 306 electoral votes as a massive landslide. I wouldn't go that far, but it was a clear win. However, and these are important to keep in mind, Donald Trump received the second most votes of all time. Joe Biden happened to receive the most, but Donald Trump received the second most votes of all time. He has more than 70 million people who supported him. Why did they support him? For a couple of reasons. One, the fear that the new economy is leaving them behind. It's that they can't have a life. All they're doing is working now. And the work covers the living expenses, but it doesn't allow them to have a life. The new economy has left them behind. And why is that? It's because globalization is harming them more than it is helping them. And that is why he was able, even in the midst of the worst healthcare crisis the United States has seen in 100 years, more than 100 years, the worst economic crisis the United States has seen in more than 100 years, the most civil unrest we've seen in over 50 years, yet he was still able to get more than 70 million votes, and he was still able to get the second most votes of all time. It's because he tapped into those two dynamics. In addition, Republicans picked up seats in the House, and they may end up keeping the Senate. We can talk more about that later if you'd like. So the Republicans lost, but they still have a lot of strong wins at their back. They know this, and the Democrats know this too. So this is going to influence foreign policy. You have to understand these dynamics to understand where we're going. Now, Americans, Republicans and Democrats disagree on almost everything. They disagree on, guns. They disagree on abortion. They disagree on civil liberties when it comes to racial justice and what the best ways to address that are. They disagree on whether you should wear a mask to prevent COVID. Disagree on basically everything except for one thing. Americans agree on China. They agree that they have a unfavorable or very unfavorable view when it comes to China. More than any time in history do Americans have an unfavorable view on China, even more than during Tiananmen Square, even more than when the Chinese shot down or forced down an Air Force surveillance plane onto Hainan Island. So there's agreement in that China is unfavorable, and this is not partisan. This is both Democrats and Republicans. Now, we used to have a bipartisan consensus on China. Back in 2000, Bill Clinton, when he was president, and we the United States, brought China into the WTO. We said bringing China, President Clinton said bringing China into the WTO is a move in the right direction. Why? Because it is going to require China to open its markets. What happened on the Republican side? George W. Bush, when he was running for president in 1999, he said, imagine if the internet took hold in China. Imagine how freedom would spread. And to get in China to open up to freedom, we have to trade with them. Well, that bipartisan consensus is now gone. And if you look at what happened and kind of the turning point, I think, was in 2015 when China came out with its Made in China 2025 industrial policy, where they explicitly were going to leverage the power of the state to alter competitive dynamics in global markets in the core 21st century industries. And they said, we're going to have 80% market share when it comes to new energy vehicles. How are we going to do it? We're going to subsidize our own vehicles. We're going to have make purchasing mandates for government fleets. We're going to have a 95% domestic share in agriculture equipment. How are we going to do that? We're going to do that through subsidies and tax exemptions. We're going to have a 50% market share on AI. And we're going to have national and local funds provide billions of yuans in subsidies. This was something from the U.S. Chamber came out with. And so this was really the mind shift started here more than anything else. It had been building, but I think this was the pivot point. And, so the administration reacted to Made in China 2025 because it described Made in China 2025 as a policy that was unprecedented, straight state-driven interference. It would cost jobs in the US and around the world and cause significant damage to industries globally. Now, the administration that said that was not the Trump administration. It was the Obama administration. That's a quote from Secretary Pritzker. And so this shift towards China, it's not Donald Trump. It was before Donald Trump. It was building up over time because the US-China trade war, in part, was that the US policy of accommodate and engage didn't work. The thought was if we accommodated China, if we allowed them to do those subsidies for SOEs, if we allowed them to have an advantage in the WTO, if we didn't really hold their feet to the fire on all their unfair trade practices when it comes to forced technology transfers or not protecting intellectual property or outright cyber theft of not only the US government and US government employees, but of US businesses, that they would become more like us. And so if we accommodated and engaged, that would lead to what Presidents Bush and Clinton both saw coming, what didn't happen. And so we started to move to contain and isolate. And that's where the Trump administration accelerated this and took it into a much different direction than we had previously. So what does this mean? This was a quote from May 1st of 2019, where a presidential candidate said, China's not going to eat our lunch. They can't even figure out how to deal with the corruption that exists within their system. They're not bad folks. They're not competition with us. Well, this Democratic candidate, about 2 months later, said that China's making massive investments in technologies in the future. China's pressing its advantage all over the world. Okay, those were both from Joe Biden. Of the campaign, somewhat of the mindset of the accommodate and engage, and that we are a superior competitor when it comes to US v China, that shifted, and that shift is not going back. So what do we see now? We see bipartisan support on China. In some issues, the Republicans are stronger than Democrats. such as when it comes to holding them responsible for COVID, or that it's tougher to get strong on China than build a relationship. And then Democrats are more bearish on China when it comes to human rights, and that we, the United States, should hold China accountable for human rights violations, even if it harms our economic interests. But that's barely. Both sides are pretty strong, Democrats and Republicans, on doing that. So this is the dynamic in the United States that you have the Biden administration is going to have to deal with, and it's going to have to deal with it with a very narrow margin in the House and potentially with the Republicans in control of the Senate. So what is the change that the Biden administration sees when it comes to dealing with China? Yeah, I think, President-elect Biden during the campaign said, look, President Trump was tough on China, and I'm going to be tough but effective on China. So that's one change, which we'll talk about later. The other change is that it can't all be about confrontation when it comes to China. It has to also be that there are going to be times when we confront China. We're going to confront them on human rights. We're going to confront them on their unfair trade practices. We're going to confront them when they don't live up to their agreements. But there are other times we have to compete with them. And how do we compete with them? We compete with them on development. We can't cede the Belt and Road Initiative to them. And I know Sri Lanka has some experience with the Belt and Road Initiative, or certainly South Asia does. And so we're going to have to compete with them and put more development money in there. So there is that opportunity. And then we're going to have to cooperate with China. When it's in our national interest to cooperate, and when it's in China's national interest to cooperate, we can cooperate and confront at the same time. And the two areas of cooperation are going to be on both COVID and the future pandemics, and on climate change and climate risk. So that's the approach the Biden team will have, but it's also going to have a domestic policy principle that applies to China. Jake Sullivan, who's going to be the head of the NSC, I think this was his quote, where he said, the US should put less focus on trying to slow China down and more emphasis on trying to run faster ourselves. How do we run faster ourselves? It's going to be all about Build Back Better and everything that goes into that when it goes into investment into infrastructure and investment into sustainable infrastructure and all of those type of activities, building resilience by bringing more factories back to the United States. So that's how we run faster as the United States. So that's the other thing to keep in mind, is that there's going to be a much more of a domestic policy element to a Biden foreign policy than the Trump administration had. They had some, but it was more about protectionism. This is going to have a different approach, hopefully a bipartisan approach. Okay, so what is it that businesses should be thinking out as U.S. foreign policy will shift under Biden, as I've described a bit? So this is an op-ed I wrote for the Straits Times about a month ago or so. And I think there's really key thematics for the incoming administration that businesses need to be thinking about. The Biden administration, look, we don't know what is going to happen. There are too many unknown variables for how a Biden foreign policy is going to play out. What is going to happen with COVID and the vaccines, and how quickly can the U.S. come out of its health crisis and economic crisis? Who's going to win the Georgia Senate seats? And is that going to give the president-elect more or less flexibility when it comes to his foreign policy team getting confirmed? What is President Xi going to do in reaction to all of this? Until you know all of those things and so many other variables, you can't know for sure. No crystal ball to say this is what the Biden team is going to do. But we can understand where the Biden approach is thematically. And I think that is the way for a business to think about what should it be doing as it sees geopolitics impacting their business. And the three thematics are that the Biden administration is going to engage multilaterally, they are going to incorporate sustainability, and they are going to shift into a pro-democratic direction. So thematic one, multilateralism. So what is it that is going to change from the Trump administration? Well, this is a shift back. This will revert back to a more traditional American foreign policy where you work with allies, you work with like-minded countries to advance the U.S. interest. When the U.S. works with like-minded countries, it advances its interest. When it works unilaterally, as it did under Donald Trump and his definition of America first, it doesn't work. And that's, exactly what Joe Biden said, what he meant when he said that Donald Trump was tough on China, but Joe Biden will be tough but effective. How will he be effective? He'll be effective because he's going to work with the EU. He's going to work with Japan. He's going to work with Korea. He's going to work with other nations when it comes to addressing China's unfair trade practices. And so that is going to be a thematic. And so that's going to change a lot of how countries in our part of the world, in this part of the, this part of the globe, are going to be dealing with the United States and dealing with China. And there's going to be some trade-offs they're going to have to make. Now, he's said that he's, not immediately going to reduce the tariffs on China, but he's going to take a review of it, and he's going to try and develop this coherent strategy. So we can talk more about what this means in terms of supply chains and the redistribution of supply chains and companies needing to become more resilient with their supply chains. But this is going to play into that. It is also going to be a multilateral approach when it comes to the U.S. joining back to the Paris Climate Agreement. This does not require congressional approval. So regardless of the Senate being under control of the Republicans or the Democrats, the U.S. will re-enter Paris. That one is an exception to the rule. We can make that prediction, and that's going to have an impact for companies, as well as working multilaterally, such as with the World Health Organization. So this multilateral approach is something to keep in mind. The second is there's going to be a focus on sustainability. Now, sustainability I take from a ESG perspective, from an environmental social governance perspective. So it is how countries, how businesses conduct themselves, and how a business has its impact on the environment as it operates as a business, how it impacts society through worker health and safety, or through responsible sourcing, through promoting diversity and inclusion, and then on governance when it comes to corruption. All of those things, that ESG mindset, that is going to be part of how the Biden team thinks about foreign policy. It's going to be a sustainable foreign policy, and front and center is going to be on climate change. And you saw that with President Biden appointing, former Secretary of State John Kerry as a cabinet level special envoy on climate. And it's not only that the U.S. is going to have to reduce its own emissions, but it is going to undertake energetic diplomacy to pressure other countries to make their own ambitious pledges. Every country is going to be expected to do this, or at least the Biden administration is going to try. So if you're investing in palm oil, if you're investing in coal, this could have an impact on your business. There are opportunities certainly when it comes to renewables with this focus on sustainability and the environment. There's also going to be a focus on sustainability when it comes to human rights. During a fundraising event, then candidate Biden said he is going to take on Xi on his violation of human rights. He's going to challenge him when he does that. This has been something the Trump administration has been doing, and the Congress has certainly been doing this. It's been looking very closely at forced labor. There are potential sanctions coming on forced labor when it comes to Xinjiang and cotton in particular coming out of China, and that could have a huge impact in terms of raising prices. And if you're sourcing cotton from China, this could be for textiles, this could be a major issue for you wherever you And even if you're not sourcing it, could make cotton a lot more expensive as you manufacture in textiles. It's also going to be on not just in China. The U.S. has sanctioned a Malaysian company over forced labor, and that these types of focus on human rights is, can only be expected to continue as the Biden team has a values-based foreign policy. So something to keep in mind. And the third is we're going to see more of a pro-democracy shift. This has been underway already. There is something that the Trump administration did called the Indo-Pacific Transparency Initiative. And it has a lot of anti-corruption efforts where the goal is to promote civil society, rule of law. There are funding of journalists and advocacy groups to expose corruption, drive reform. So if you are doing business in a country that has transparency issues, that has corruption issues, this is going to be something different. The FCPA may not apply to you if you're not a US company not doing business with the United States, but I think it's going to be more of a focus on an anti-corruption effort. In 2019, I saw that the USAID supported Sri Lanka's launch of an e-government procurement platform. Obviously, when you get things online, you make it more transparent, you move away from paper-based, you take out a lot of opportunities for rent seeking or other such activities. So expect to see this go on, and this is going to be highlighted by the new administration Summit for Democracy, and it's going to be looking to secure commitments to combat authoritarianism. Something that businesses are going to have to be aware of as they take into account who they're doing business with, what sectors are they in, what changes are going to be coming. Are you going to see more sanctions on cotton, on cocoa, on cashews, on all other sorts of commodities that have human rights implications? So with that, I will stop my formal presentation and very much look forward to a discussion.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for that informative view and information shared. I personally didn't know that a lot of this, the position on China had actually started with Obama. That's quite interesting to understand. Yeah, certainly. I've got some questions coming from the audience. Before we jump into that, something I would like to touch on is trade shifts, which is basically the supply chain shifts that are taking place across Asia, predominantly out from China. And this is not only to do with the tariffs, but also to do with the supply chain risks that became apparent with the COVID lockdown that happened in factories across China. And a lot of production across the world had either stopped or supply chains came to a standstill. So do you see this accelerating under Biden in any form? Is it going to be, is it going to be promoted where we're going to nearshore back to the US, or are we going to go into friendly countries and position some of these industries?
Yeah, well, look, there's a lot of competing trends that some of them are governmental and some of them are not governmental, that are accelerating the redistribution of supply chains. Like, and some of it with China was happening because China was getting more expensive, right? And so you were seeing a shift of supply chain out of China, predominantly to Vietnam. Vietnam was, the biggest winner. One, because it was close. Two, because obviously the low labor costs that you had there. And you started to get a logistics and infrastructure being built up there. So that started even before the trade war. Now that really got accelerated under the trade war. And then you saw more of a shift to Vietnam, with some other countries picking up, some of that here and there. Then what's accelerated even further is the pandemic. And that isn't going to stop. So even if you bring down the tariffs, if you find some agreement in the US-China trade war, which was another accelerant of the shift of the supply chain out of China, you are still going to see a shift of a supply chain out of China because of the pandemic, because you can't have all your eggs in one basket. And so the question businesses are asking themselves now is you've gone, first it was all China, and then you had a China +1. Now you're going to have a China +2, China +3. That is what businesses are trying to think through now. So you're going to have a trade-off of increased costs to put resilience into your supply chain. What you have other dynamics happening as well is you see multilateral trading frameworks come together. You have two, I wouldn't say they're competing, they're complementary, is TPP, or now CPTPP, which is a much higher standard trade agreement that deals with, that you have Japan and Singapore, Australia, Vietnam in the region, in that Malaysia in it, but hasn't ratified it yet, as well as Brunei, in addition to Canada and Mexico, Chile. So you have those, you have that trade agreement, but then you have RCEP, which of course India famously or infamously is pulled out of. Now RCEP is not nearly as comprehensive as TPP. It doesn't get to a lot of the 21st century issues, especially when it comes to IPR and free flow of data. It doesn't have the high standards for the environment or labor. It doesn't address unfair competition with SOEs like the TPP does. But it has, you know, China, Japan, Korea, all 10 of ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand. So you see that there is a need for multilateral trading frameworks, and businesses are going to be taking advantage of that. And so the question is, who else is going to join RCEP next? The question is, who is going to join TPP next? And will the US come back to a multilateral trading system under a Biden administration, which I think a lot of the foreign policy people would like to see theoretically, but you have everything I talked about in terms of the politics in the US, where people say, hey, I haven't benefited from globalization. Why are you going to do this to me again? So that's what the US needs to work out. And it's going to take time for the US to work that out. But you are seeing the continued allocation of the supply chain out of China. You will always stay in China because it's going to be your most important market, but it'll be a China +2, China +3, as opposed to a China +1 as a result of the pandemic.
Thank you, Stephen. That was an interesting insight. We have a question from the audience. What are the trade adaptations in policy that states like Sri Lanka can adopt in order to gain a sustainable approach in our economy throughout the Biden administration? So what I'm willing to understand is trade adaptations in policy that we can implement that'll help us win some favor with the Biden administration over the long period.
I think it's the same thematics that I spoke about. So it's how are you going to address the climate risk that's happening? What are you going to do to become more sustainable from an environmental perspective? And this applies to, like, it applies to agriculture, but it applies to mining. It applies to, what sources is your power generation going to come from? So that, moving towards a more sustainable approach when it comes to the environment, moving to a more sustainable approach when it comes to human rights. What type of rules do you have in place to ensure there is no child labor in your factories or on your farms, in your fields? There's no child labor. There's no forced labor. There's, fair wages. People get paid overtime. So all of those types of things that need to get, that have that sustainability aspect from the human rights perspective. And then there's the transparency when it comes to governance. As I mentioned, Sri Lanka's moved, or as I do not know Sri Lanka well, so I'm gonna not gonna get deep into Sri Lankan laws, but clearly, the movement into e-government, getting outside of paper, getting more transparency when it comes to customs, when it comes to licensing, when it comes to approvals. All of those things are going to reduce corruption. So I think that is the thematics that businesses should be thinking about as well, because governments are probably going to be going in that direction. So if governments are going in that direction, you will have opportunities as a business to go in that direction. And if you don't, you are going to have challenges.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Stephen, you mentioned on the whole energy and sustainability aspect of it. The energy lobby in the US is strong. Oil and gas, coal, they are well known to be able to change global policies. So you mentioned something very interesting, that there may be pressures on polluting industries like, for example, coal or oil. How will this be implemented when there's such a strong energy lobby in the US? And I'm using this question because our government in Sri Lanka just approved a new 300 megawatt coal power plant. So in your view, how can this be pushed through?
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple different dynamics. And obviously there's always going to be countervailing pressures for all of these changes, where you have winners and losers when it comes to government policy. The other thing that's happening in the US is to keep in mind where the consumer is going and what the consumers are demanding. And so this shift isn't only going to come from regulation or changes in laws. It is also going to come from what consumers are going to be demanding. And this is one of those issues, though, that I think is going to have a major, how the outcome of the Georgia Senate races happens in January 5th is going to have a major answer or major force on how to answer this question. So just very briefly, right now, the Senate is split 50 to 48. So there's 50 Republicans, there's 48 Democrats. The Vice President of the United States is the tiebreaker when it comes to a 50-50 vote. So when the Vice President is Vice President Harris and not Vice President Pence, if the Democrats are tied 50-50, it means they win. So if the Democrats control the Senate and they control the House and they control the White House, you're going to see more changes on laws when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to incentives on renewables, when it comes to R&D on renewables, when it comes to tax policy. All of those things will be very different under a Democratic-controlled Senate than a Republican-controlled Senate. It doesn't mean that coal is going to be outlawed in the United States. That's certainly not going to happen if the Democrats controlled, the Senate, House, and White House. But it will be a shift. So if the Republicans keep the Senate, you're going to probably have less of an emphasis. You will still have an emphasis on becoming a greener economy, a greener infrastructure, but it won't nearly be the same. But yeah, the premise of the question, things are not going to change overnight when it comes to coal or other forms of non-renewables.
Thank you, Stephen. So if I heard you right, we've got through obviously tax concessions, understanding on innovation and grants possibly on renewables, the policy will be a longer term shift towards renewable, right? Yeah.
Certainly, and that's going to be driven by the millennials. They like the millennials who you can pick up almost any demographic and say this is who won the election. Well, the progressives won the election, the millennials won the election. Actually, in Georgia, which I don't know how many Democrats or broad members there are in Sri Lanka, but I imagine there's a couple who voted for president as an expat in Sri Lanka. There were 20,000 Americans overseas, Democrats overseas, who voted in Georgia for Joe Biden. So the expat, and I'm not one of them, but the expat vote, you could say, got Joe Biden, the won Joe Biden Georgia. So you have all of these. You have all of these demographics that you have to think about. But the most important demographic you have to think about for both parties, I think, is, millennials and youngers. And look, their top three issues, climate change maybe, is probably number one. So it's climate change, it's income inequality, and it's racial justice. And so, yeah, we're going in that direction. I don't know, it'll be 2 years, 4 years. Hopefully it's not before it's too late and we can't address the climate anymore, but that's where we're headed.
Thank you, Stephen. Stephen, I got another interesting question from the audience. Stephen, do you have any insight on possible trade concessions or tariff preferences? Any interesting insights on what might be there for South Asia under Biden?
Not particularly. I mean, I think not until you start negotiating on trade, and there's a saying that, when we would do trade deals, nothing is agreed upon until everything is agreed upon. So you could have a concession in one part of a trade agreement and not in another, and then you go back and have to shift everything. So I think impossible to know until you really start getting into the negotiating. I think there's a concern that there's going to start being concessions, and I've heard this from friends in foreign governments in the region, that there will be concessions for China on trade if they will do more on the climate. So if China will say, well, we're going to cut our greenhouse gas emissions by eliminating this much in terms of coal, therefore you give us more time to transition when it comes to SOEs or when it comes to some other issue. And I think the plan is, climate is climate. You don't negotiate, okay, you can have more time with your SOEs if you do what you should be doing on climate. What you should be doing on climate is in your national interest and is in our national interest. We're not going to trade climate for IPR protection. So I think that is, I think, going to be, tough to do sometimes. But I mean, I think that will be one where you're not going to see trade-offs of one aspect for another. You're going to try and hold the line on those types of things. But there will certainly be more of a multilateral approach in trying to have the different governments work together. I think if you're going to incentivize people when it comes to moving to renewables, will certainly come out. But you're also going to see sanctions on things when it comes to human rights, which, credit to the Trump administration, they have been doing. And I think that will certainly only continue under a Biden administration.
Thank you, Stephen. You used the word renewable and sustainability numerous times today. So I understand that that's going to carry a lot of weight. So to anyone from the government or looking at policy point of view from Sri Lanka, it's very interesting that I guess our improving US-Sri Lanka ties from a bilateral level. So I think sustainability and environmental concerns will be a top priority. Am I correct to say that, Stephen?
Well, certainly within the context of, the relationship when it comes to development, when it comes, to this, to the movement towards transparency. I mean, all of these things are going to fit together as, the Biden administration has what we would have called in the past a more values-based foreign policy. So it's not going to be the realpolitik that you saw under, Henry Kissinger, for example, and it's not going to be a unilateral foreign policy under Donald Trump, where the only metric that mattered when it came to trade was what is the trade balance between, our country and your country. You're not going to see what I referred to as, the Donald Trump's bully bargain and brag approach to bilateral relationships, where it was, all that mattered was having the U.S. use its greater economic strength to bully our counterparts into allies alike into making concessions, and then you bargain over that, and then you brag you just got the greatest trade deal of all time. You're not going to see that under a Biden administration, but it is going to be that values-based approach. Means you're going to have to be looking at all of these things. As they say, sustainability, it's not just about the environment. It's put my private equity hat on, it's having an ESG approach to business. And it's the same thing. It's what led to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and coming out with those targets. How do you change how you operate as a business or what you do as a country to reduce the harm that you cause through greenhouse gas emissions, through water? How much water do you use? Through the use of what you do with your waste, and do you treat it properly? How do you treat your employees? How do you treat your citizens? What type of governance do you have in place? It's that ESG mindset that really kind of, obviously it's broader than private equity, but it started more as a private equity term that has now branched out into all businesses and is really the foundation of the UN Sustainable Development Goals that every country has a target towards.
Thank you. Interesting. Stephen, a little stretched on the topic, but there was a potential flare-ups in the South China Sea or Taiwan were a possibility a few months back. Will this military stare down with China continue, or do you see it being de-escalated?
I get questions like that, or variants of questions like that. And it's always, what's Joe Biden going to do with the South China Sea? What's Joe Biden going to do on Taiwan? And I always say, well, what is President Xi going to do in the South China Sea? What is President Xi going to do when it comes to Taiwan? What's President Xi going to do when it comes to Hong Kong? What's President Xi going to do when it comes to Xinjiang, Tibet, all of those things? So I think it is more. This is not just a U.S. question. It's not can Joe Biden de-escalate the tensions with China? And I always say, look, what drove me crazier than anything else is when people would call it Trump's trade war. I would say, no, it's not Trump's trade war. The trade war started because China has been engaging in unfair trade practices for a decade or more. China has not lived up to its commitments, either in letter or in spirit, for many years. China has been using, as the Obama administration pointed out, its industrial policy to have an unfair advantage when it comes to the key industries of the 21st century. Yet everybody called it Trump's trade war. So no, it's not Trump's trade war. Everything that the U.S. government laid out under Donald Trump, which justified his justification for the tariffs. If you really want to get deep into it, go read the USTR Section 301 report, which gave the underlying authority for Donald Trump to issue those tariffs against China a couple of years ago. I mean, those were all things engaged in by China. So I really think it's less a question on what is the Biden administration going to do, as opposed to what is China going to do. And a lot of what the US has been asking for China to do is in China's, it's in China's self-interest. It's in China's self-interest to have more IPR protection. Might not have been 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. But they have so much more intellectual property to protect now. So shouldn't it be in China's interest to be, have more fair and protection and open rules and rights to enforce when it comes to IPR? And so if they do that, and if you can have a different approach to China to have them do that, you can de-escalate fairly quickly. You can de-escalate quicker in the South China Sea if you get everybody working together again. So a lot of this, I think, can be set up by a different approach by the US, but you have to see what China's going to do.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you. I like that. We'll see what China does, and then you'll understand. Stephen, I'd like you to wear your PE hat for just as you wrap up. What are your views on the opportunities or shifts or even pitfalls in 2021 in this post-COVID world? From a PE hat on. Yeah.
Okay, no, sure. So I think going back, I'm going to use the word sustainability again, but that is where you see a lot of investment that wants to see more sustainable growth. And so you have these funds that are now being referred to as impact funds or sustainable funds, where the private equity firms have an approach where they have that ESG mindset. And the question is, how do you de-risk the business and how do you create value by thinking sustainably that is going to give you a better return? And there are certain sectors that are easier to justify that to. So I think if you look in healthcare, if you look in education, if you look in agriculture, and certainly in terms of sustainable agriculture, all of those sectors that are really showing that you can have a market-based return and have a positive societal impact, that is where you're seeing billions, if not billions and billions of dollars flowing into private equity funds, or and I should say all private capital funds. So it's infrastructure, it's credit, it's renewables, it's traditional private equity, it's venture capital. That is a very hot right now. Now it takes a mindset shift from the private capital investors. It also means you're going to have some more demands on who you're investing in. So, for example, if you're going to invest in solar in Sri Lanka and in anywhere, you just can't say, well, I'm going to invest in solar, therefore it's a sustainable investment and I'm done. You have to ask yourself, well, where do those solar panels get manufactured, and are they being manufactured in the most environmentally sustainable way? What happens when the solar panel's life, the solar panel no longer is going to be used? How do you dispose of the solar panel? Where do you put, right, the solar farm? Are you going to displace villagers? Because that is not very sustainable. Or are you going to disrupt agriculture? Are you going to disrupt, bird migration? If you have solar panels there, or if you have a wind farm, what is that going to do? So it's you just can't say, well, I'm going to be an investor in renewables, therefore I'm a sustainable investor, or I'm an impact investor. But it's those funds that are getting that have that ESG mindset can really get that billions and billions of dollars that's out there, especially from US investors, European investors, Australian investors, who are looking for those things, and they're looking to do those types of things in emerging markets. And so emerging markets it's easier to show impact for a lot less money. You can have a lot greater impact in an emerging market. Most of Southeast Asia, certainly Sri Lanka would constitute, an emerging market from a private equity perspective or a private capital perspective. So lots of opportunities if you can show that right mindset and you can manage and measure to a sustainable outcome. I think that's kind of that's kind of the space I'm focused on in private equity right now. It's a very exciting space to be in. Very challenging, but a lot of opportunity.
Thank you, Stephen. And private equity traditionally follows returns. So do you see governments around the world, or even at least the US government, giving preferential trade or special concessions for any investments that are happening into renewable or sustainable businesses?
Yeah, no, I think you're going to see a lot more of that. And I think you're going to see, if you kind of think of there's, I used the 3 C's before when it came to the Biden administration approach, to China. You have confront, compete, and cooperate. Well, kind of think there's 3 D's when it comes to foreign policy, right? So you have defense, you have diplomacy, and you have development. Now, those are the 3 Ds. And the Trump administration was not entirely, didn't ignore it, but less focused on the development side of it. And we can argue whether they were, I'll put my Democratic hat on, we can argue whether they were successful diplomatically as well. But you're going to see certainly all 3 of those approaches when it comes to a Biden administration foreign policy. So you're going to see you're still going to see the defense, that's not going to change. You're going to see the diplomatic, and you're going to see a shift in diplomacy away from unilateral to multilateral. But you're going to see a lot more on the development side. You're going to see, the DFC, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. It should get a lot more money from the Congress. It should get a different approach from the Biden administration. It's going to accelerate what it has started to do, and it is going to focus on, I think a big focus there is going to be on sustainable infrastructure. So you're going to have a lot of opportunities when it comes to that development aspect of foreign policy is the Biden administration will carry it out. So opportunities for governments and opportunities for businesses to be part of those, public-private partnerships when it comes to, especially when it comes to infrastructure on the development side. And this gets, I'm going back from the 3 Ds to the 3 Cs, this gets to be how you compete with China. You don't cede the development agenda to China through the Belt and Road Initiative, right? You come up with other ways to do that. And Japan has been very strong in this area in Asia for decades on the development side. And you're going to see the US, I think, do more multilaterally when it comes to development. And the Indo-Pacific strategy, or the Quad, how call different things, but that Indo-Pacific strategy. Look, a lot of these strategies start out from a defense perspective, and in a way because it's easier. You have those military to military relationships, and so it starts out as defense, and they grow over time to include economics, to include diplomacy, and I think that would naturally happen. I think it'll happen even faster under a Biden administration. So a lot to look for there as well.
Wow, thank you, Stephen. Good insight, and nice to have someone who wears a policy and a PE hat at the same time. So you get both views. So yeah, interesting insight. Stephen, we are 1 minute to our hour, and we blocked your time in. So thank you from AmCham Sri Lanka, Stephen, for taking the time. Me and our participants and from the chamber, we appreciate what you shared, the insights given. And since you've been to Sri Lanka 12 years ago, we look forward to seeing you in Colombo or in Sri Lanka very soon. Thank you.
Next time we do this one in person, and I promise to be there.
Done. Over to you, Rai.
Thank you, Prasanta. And thank you, Stephen, for some wonderful insights and an absolutely well spent hour, I think, in terms of for each of us and for each of our audience members as well. We had a ton of questions coming in, and I know Prasanta would have had a time sort of sifting through and trying to club them together when he presented them to you. But that just shows how much of an interest there is in the topic, and of course, in terms of international relations as well. So thank you on behalf of AmCham Sri Lanka, and of course, on behalf of our audience as well.
Thank you.
So next time on the AmCham Sri Lanka IFS Premier Series, we have, which is scheduled, I believe, for the 17th of December, which is just a couple of weeks down the line. We'll be speaking to James Kim, who is the Chairman CEO of AmCham Korea. And James will be talking to us about how the business policies and the business principles and ethics of South Korea, which is one of Asia's tigers, has helped them and helped in terms of their business continuity and their business development, and what lessons we here in Sri Lanka can take from that as we continue to progress and develop in what we are doing as well. So from myself and on behalf of the AmCham team, and of course on behalf of our panelists, thank you to each and every one of you who joined us here today. Don't forget to check up or take a look at our YouTube channel, where you can catch up on any of the previous sessions that you missed. And of course, don't forget to mark down on your diaries the third Thursday of the next few months for the AmCham SL IFS Premier Series. Thank you, good night, and have a wonderful weekend as well. Bye-bye.